Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you here today on behalf of First Presbyterian Church. Amanda's presentation today is actually the culmination of a month-long series that we've had, and it's been hosted by our Work for Change group. And the series allowed us to learn a lot more. Some of us didn't know anything, some of us knew a bit more, but a lot more about Christian nationalism as we prepared for the culmination of that series, which was Amanda's visit today. So we're looking forward to learning together with all of you as Amanda helps us to further understand what Christian nationalism is, and more importantly, how we can identify it and work to address it in our local and in our broader communities. Amanda Tyler is Executive Director of the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, also known as BJC. She leads the organization as it upholds the historic Baptist principle of religious liberty, defending the free exercise of religion and protecting against its establishment by government. She's the lead organizer of BJC's Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign, and she is also co-host of BJC's Respecting Religion podcast, and it's great. Y'all should look for it. Amanda's constitutional law analysis and advocacy for faith freedom for all has been featured by many major news outlets, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, CBS News, ABC News, CNN, MSNBC. The Religion News Service named her one of 2022's Rising Stars in Religion, and she regularly preaches in Baptist churches, speaks at denominational gatherings, and leads sessions on college campuses and with community groups of all sizes, just like ours here today. Amanda is a member of the Texas and U.S. Supreme Court Bar. She has experience working in Congress, in a private legal practice, and serving as a law clerk for a federal judge. She testified before Congress in 2022 and in 2023 about the ways in which Christian nationalism provides cover for white supremacy, and in 2018 about threats to religious liberty around the world. Amanda graduated from the Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service at Georgetown University with a bachelor's degree in foreign service, magna cum laude, and she earned her JD with honors from the University of Texas School of Law. In 2019, the school named her their Outstanding Young Alumna. Following law school, Amanda worked in private practice and served as a law clerk for a U.S. District Court judge here in Dallas. She worked on the staff of U.S. Representative Lloyd Doggett in Austin and Washington for several years, serving as the congressman's district director and then as his counsel for the Ways and Means Committee. Obviously, after all that, Amanda is extremely accomplished, and we are very excited and honored to have her with us today. Welcome, Amanda. We look forward to learning from you more about this extremely important topic.
Well, thank you so much, Robin, and thanks to the Work for Change group here at First Presbyterian Church of Richardson for inviting me, for studying Christian nationalism. I was talking with Robin before I came up today, and she was reminding me she first had the idea to invite me here 8 months ago. So this event is a long time in the making, and I really appreciate that very much. And thank you to all of you for making time on a Sunday afternoon to come and learn more about how we might work to dismantle Christian nationalism. Not exactly a light topic, but one that I think is really important, and I'm really grateful to have all of you here today. I did want to explain, I do have slides, as you've noticed, because I think it helps make some of this material a little bit easier to absorb. And I know that for some of you, especially if you've been studying the curriculum from Christians Against Christian Nationalism, some of this may already be a little familiar, but I think you'll also learn some new things today. But for all of you, I do have a number of QR codes throughout the presentation. And so some of this, if you want to at different points I'll let you know what's there, and you can store it in your phone and go back and look at it later as well. This first QR code, though, is simply a request to let me know that you're here and to stay in touch with the work of BJC. So it's a very quick thing to fill out here with just your name and email address so that we can stay in touch. And then also all of the social handles here for BJC, as well as for the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. I imagine that for many of you, you might be learning or hearing about BJC, the organization that I lead, for the first time today. And so I just wanted to give you a little introduction about what we do at BJC. BJC stands for Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty. We are an 88-year-old advocacy and education organization that's headquartered on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C., and our mission is to advocate for everyone's faith freedom. So we do that not just for Baptists, but for people of all faith traditions and for people who don't claim a faith tradition. And this comes out of a theological value that Baptists have called soul freedom, and this idea that it is up to each person to have a personal connection with God, and that we may say yes to God and we may say no to God, and that no one, no earthly authority should come between our relationship with God. And so we're in a long line of Baptists who have stood up for the separation of church and state as the best relationship to protect this faith freedom. A little bit more, and there won't be a lot about Baptists here, but a little bit more about Baptists and why we are the only denominationally based organization in the country that is dedicated to religious freedom and separation of church and state. We come from a very long line of Baptists, all the way back from the beginning, that have stood up for everyone's faith freedom. And I think that Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s words here are particularly apt. He once said that the church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state. And he's really speaking here about the healthiest relationship between religion and government, and that is the separation of the institutions of church and state. And of course, that's the arrangement that is protected by the U.S. Constitution's First Amendment and many state constitutional and statutory provisions. This arrangement that separates the institutions of church and state is good for our pluralistic society. It speaks to this truth and helps protect this truth that one's belonging in American society should never depend on what we believe or how we worship or how we identify religiously, or even if we claim to be religious or not. But it's also good for religious institutions, because the separation of church and state gives religious institutions like this one, and like all of the others that are flourishing around the DFW Metroplex, the necessary freedom to follow the dictates of our religion in ways that don't impose on the religious freedom of our neighbors without unnecessary state involvement. And so this is the promise of the First Amendment. This is the promise of this ideal of the separation of church and state. But we have to acknowledge that we've never really fully achieved that promise, that ideal of belonging regardless of religious identity. And I believe that one reason for that is because opposing these ideals of religious freedom from the very beginning has been this deeply seated ideology of Christian nationalism. And so now, almost 5 years ago, BJC, working ecumenically with our partners in Washington, D.C., decided to start something called the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. It really grows out of our decades-long work for religious freedom for all. But in 2019, we were coming off of this line of increasingly violent episodes or events that happened at houses of worship around the country. There was the shooting at Mother Emanuel AME Church in 2017. There was the rally, the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017. And then there was the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh in 2018. And so we had this growing awareness of how deadly violent Christian nationalism was getting in the country, and a real compelling need, we thought, to name Christian nationalism, to help people understand what it is, and to give the tools to help dismantle it. Because our neighbors were literally being killed with these Christian nationalist beliefs in the hands of white supremacists. And so we sat around a table with our usual coalition allies in Washington, D.C., groups that were other Christian groups, including people from PCUSA, but other Episcopalians and Lutherans and Methodists, but also some of our Jewish allies, some of our Muslim allies, people from other faith traditions. And we said, we think we should do something about this. And it was our friends from other faith traditions, from Muslim and Sikh and Jewish faith traditions and others, who said, we agree with you that this is a deadly problem that needs to be called out forcefully, but we think that you Christians are the ones that need to take the lead in calling out Christian nationalism. First of all, it's mostly your problem, Christians. This is not our problem to solve. But more importantly, we simply do not feel safe in this country calling out Christian nationalism with the kind of fervor and intensity that we think it needs to be called out. And so we took them we took those words to heart, and that was the origin of what became the Christians Against Christian Nationalism campaign. Now, I will name one of the criticisms of the campaign right off the top, and that is, why do you only have to say what you're against? Why can't you say what you're for? And we're going to have a conversation here today about how we best describe what we are for. But we thought it was really important, especially in this moment 5 years ago, that we state clearly what we were against. And if you can kind of put yourself in a time machine to 5 years ago, I bet that Christian nationalism was not a term that was quite as common then as it is now. I can tell you, empirically, just from looking at Google Analytics and things like that it was simply not used with this kind of frequency that it is today. And so one of our goals was simply to raise awareness around Christian nationalism as a concept. Because in the words of James Baldwin, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed if it's not faced. And so we thought it was really important to put some language around this ideology. But we don't stop there at Christians Against Christian Nationalism. We don't just define it, but we really talk about what do we need to do to dismantle it, and what kind of vision do we have for a society that exists without Christian nationalism. Before I get into some definitions or understandings, I think right from the beginning, one of the goals of the campaign is to answer this question: what is Christian nationalism, and how do we recognize it? But first, I wanted to look at a broader definition of religious nationalism, which I'm going to define today as a fusion of national and religious identities and goals, and state that it's been a recurrent problem throughout history and around the world today. So we're going to zoom in a moment on Christian nationalism in the U.S. context, but first I want to think about the broader issue of religious nationalism. When it comes to religious nationalism as far as a merger of Christianity and nation, I think historically we can go all the way back to Constantine. The first time that a political ruler actually identified Christianity as the religion for the entire group of people, in that case the empire. But there have been other examples from other faith traditions of religious nationalism throughout history, and we can look around the world today and name other examples of religious nationalism around the world, including in Russia, India, Hungary, a number of African countries, including Zambia, Nigeria, and Ethiopia. And we can also see religious nationalism present in the incredibly complicated conflict that is happening right now between Israel and Hamas in Gaza. So religious nationalism is a world problem. So I want us to think now more specifically about Christian nationalism in the American context, but to know that it is not disconnected from these other examples of religious nationalism. So this QR code, by the way, will take you to the ChristiansAgainstChristianNationalism.org website, where there are all these materials, many of which I'm going to talk about here today. But if you want to be able to get there quickly, you can use the camera function on your phone to go there as well. So the definition that I'd like to provide for Christian nationalism, and the one that we use at Christians Against Christian Nationalism, is this. Christian nationalism is a political ideology and a cultural framework that seeks to merge American and Christian identities. Christian nationalism, in other words, says that to be a real American, one has to be a Christian. And not just any kind of Christian, but specifically a white Christian who holds certain fundamentalist religious beliefs that are often in line with certain conservative political priorities. That is the true American, and that everyone else has inherently second-class citizen status, that they don't fully belong as full Americans if they don't have that religious identity. Now, some markers of Christian nationalism are these. One, Christian nationalism relies very heavily on this mythological history of America as a quote-unquote Christian nation. Now, I want to pause there because sometimes this kind of gets hung up. Well, it depends on what you mean by a Christian nation. I mean, if you're describing the United States from a demographic perspective, for most of our history, the majority of people in the United States have identified as Christian. Well, what does that mean? That doesn't always mean that a majority of the people in the United States have not always gone to church. A majority of the people in the United States have not been from one kind of Christian perspective, but there has been a majority of Americans who are Christian. But that's not, when people say America is a Christian nation, that is not typically what they mean. Rather, they mean that America was founded by Christians in order to privilege Christianity in law and policy and society. Sometimes it comes out by saying things like the founding documents were divinely inspired, or our laws are based on Christian values or sometimes Judeo-Christian values. That Christianity was inherent in, that God's providential hand has been guiding America through history, all the way up into the present, and that America plays a special role in God's plan for the world. These are all examples of the Christian nation story that Christian nationalism relies so heavily on. In some ways, Christian nationalism is an exaggerated form and overlaps with American exceptionalism and other stories such as the doctrine of discovery. This idea that God wanted to use white Europeans, or Europeans who came here, in order to further God's plan for the world. And so Europeans had a divine mandate to take land, to enslave Africans, to do all of those things, that those were all part of God's plan for the world. And that story is all kind of baked in to this Christian nation narrative and to Christian nationalism itself. Now, Christian nationalism has been around for a long time, but the term, as it is being used in sociology and in media and in presentations like this, it is relatively new. I would say over the last 15 years, really, Christian nationalism has been used to describe this package of beliefs that has been around for a long time. And over the last several years, there have been a number of social science surveys that have tried to measure Christian nationalism in the public. And this started with a couple of sociologists of religion who worked together. Samuel Perry and Andrew Whitehead published a book in 2020 called Taking America Back for God. And then there have been other studies since then by PRRI and the Brookings Institution, as well as Pew, that have tried to measure for Christian nationalism in the culture. And so I wanted to give you some of the kind of top line of how Christian nationalism is being measured and what some of the studies have shown. One thing all of these surveys do, they use similar questions to test for Christian nationalism in the culture. And it comes very much off of these markers. Some of the questions have to do with how much a respondent desires the U.S. to declare itself a Christian nation, or whether it is important that laws reflect Christian values. And then they measure Christian nationalism along a continuum. And so this is, I think, very important when we talk about Christian nationalism. It is not a diagnosis. It is not something that you either have or you don't. It is rather like racism, an ideology that you either ascribe to, you're moving towards, or you reject, you're moving away from. And it is something that we all have a continuing opportunity to either embrace or reject on a daily basis. It is not something, it is something that moves and is not static. And so all of these surveys measure a particular group of people at a particular point in time. So I think that the trends are really instructive and help understand how prevalent Christian nationalism really is in American society. So just to give you a little bit of language about this, some of these surveys, Whitehead and Perry in particular, their continuum of Christian nationalism is at one end rejectors, and then at the other end ambassadors. Okay, so people who totally reject Christian nationalism and the ideas that go with it, and the ambassadors are those who most embrace it. Here locally, an example of an ambassador of Christian nationalism would be Robert Jeffress, the pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas, who has actually taken out billboards here that say America is a Christian nation. Okay, so I think that is kind of the quintessential example of an ambassador of Christian nationalism. But then in between, you have people who are resisting Christian nationalism or accommodating it. The PRRI study uses very similar terms. They have rejectors at one end, adherents on the other, and then in the middle, skeptics and sympathizers. Okay, so now that you have some of that language, here are some of the trends. In all of these studies, the smallest group of people on these continuums are those who most embrace Christian nationalism. The smallest number of people are the ambassadors or the adherents. Now, it still shows up to be somewhere between 10 and 20% of the population. So that is not a small amount of people, but it is the smallest group on the scale. And so I think in some ways that can be encouraging to us, that it's not larger than it is, but still concerning that many people are firmly thinking that America should be a Christian nation, that Christianity should be reflected in law and policy, and that Christianity should be favored. So that's where that is. But the largest group are the people in the middle, those middle people who haven't totally rejected it and aren't completely out there pushing it, but are somehow accommodating it or just kind of skeptical about Christian nationalism. And so I think that this information helps us understand that this is not something that's just out there. It's in every social situation that we're in. It's in every faith community. It's in every neighborhood. It's in every place, that it's not just a group of people who are labeled as Christian nationalists, but rather a pervasive problem throughout the country. And so I just want to give you, this is the latest data on Christian nationalism This is from the PRRI study that came out just earlier this year. And they interviewed more than 22,000 adults, and it was for the first time the ability to estimate support for Christian nationalism in all 50 states. They found that roughly 30%, 3 in 10 Americans, are either adherents of Christian nationalism or sympathizers with Christian nationalism. That those numbers are pretty stable since they first started asking this question in 2022. And then they looked nationwide, and some of this might not be surprising to you. They found that residents of red states are significantly more likely than those in blue states to hold Christian nationalist beliefs. They found the highest level of support for Christian nationalism in the upper Midwest, and then in the deep South, and then moving up again through the Appalachian Mountains. And the 5 states that had the highest incidence of Christian nationalism, and these are people who, the highest numbers of people who are either adherents or sympathizers with it, are North Dakota. 50% of the people in their survey from North Dakota were either adherents or sympathizers. Mississippi, 50%. Alabama, 47%, West Virginia, 47%, and Louisiana, 46%. You may be surprised to learn, as I was, that Texas was actually much lower than other red states in the amount of Christian nationalism in the society. It was at 34%, so closer to the national average than other red states. There were also numbers, and I encourage you to go, if you're really interested, to go look at the PRI numbers first for digging more deeply. Sometimes people talk about Christian nationalism. Well, is this only a problem in white evangelical churches? And the answer is, it is not only a problem there, but it is the biggest problem in white evangelical churches. So they found that majorities of 2 religious groups hold Christian nationalist beliefs higher than in other groups, that majorities of them do. Among white evangelical Protestants, 2/3, or 66%, were either adherents or sympathizers to Christian nationalism, and among Hispanic Protestants, 55%. But among all other religious groups that were surveyed, they were all less than 55%. They were all less than half, less than 50%, but they were still somewhat strong in those communities. So that's why I say this is not just a problem with white evangelical Protestantism. It is a problem in every religious community. I think this is a really important point for us to consider as we think about, and this is kind of where I started, as we think about how dangerous Christian nationalism is. PRRI found that those who are most adhering to Christian nationalism are more likely than other Americans to see political struggles through the apocalyptic lens of revolution and to support political violence. And this, I think, is what we saw on display on January 6, 2021, because we saw how Christian nationalism was used in that political event to galvanize people, to infuse what was a political cause with religious fervor. And we saw that with a lot of the imagery that was on display on January 6th, in the way that people prayed when they came into the Senate chamber that day and were trying to bless their actions as being done in accordance with the will of God. But I just wanted to share with these really alarming findings from this study. They found that a majority of Christian nationalism adherents, 54%, and 45% of sympathizers agree that, quote, there is a storm coming soon that will sweep away the elites in power and restore the rightful leaders. They also found that those same people were about twice as likely as other Americans to believe that political violence may be justified. Nearly 4 in 10 Christian nationalism adherents and 1/3 of sympathizers agree that, quote, because things have gotten so off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save the country. And so this is, I think, one place where we have to be very alert to the overlap between Christian nationalism and calls for political violence. I want to turn now to how Christian nationalism overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. Now, some people, when you hear Christian nationalism, sometimes people will call it exclusively white Christian nationalism. And I'll tell you why I opt usually for the term Christian nationalism, though I do want to talk about white Christian nationalism here. I think sometimes if you hear just Christian nationalism, if you just hear white Christian nationalism, it might send the signal that you have to be white to be an adherent to Christian nationalism. And that's simply not the case. We see adherents of Christian nationalism in all different racial and ethnic categories that are surveyed in these different surveys, that people who identify as Black or Latino or Asian or any of the other categories that are given in the surveys, that they are also falling all along that spectrum of Christian nationalism. And so I think it's really important that we think about Christian nationalism not just as being a problem in white communities. Now, it is more of a problem, just like we noted it is more of a problem in the white evangelical communities, it is also more of a problem in white communities. But what I really want to center in on, though, is how Christian nationalism is often used as a cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. And that's because this Christian nation myth that we talked about earlier creates and perpetuates a sense of cultural belonging that is limited to the people who held power when the country was founding. And those are white, Protestant, Christian men who owned property. That those people are given the highest level of cultural belonging and everyone else is on a different status. And just like Christian nationalism has been a recurrent problem, white Christian nationalism has been a recurrent problem. And we can see from our past the KKK as a very stark example of white Christian nationalism with its toxic mix of white supremacy, Christian nationalism, and violence. And so I don't believe that we can talk about Christian nationalism without also talking about white supremacy. And it is vital that when we're having conversations about it, that we think about those things together. When I talk about Christian nationalism, though, I also want to talk about what Christian nationalism is not. And so I want to talk about the difference between Christian nationalism and Christianity. Christian nationalism is a gross distortion of the teachings of Jesus. Christian nationalism takes the central message of Christianity, which is a gospel of love, and turns it into a false idol of power. And it is also idolatrous in that Christian nationalism tries to merge religious authority and political authority together in ways that confuse the two and that can lead to worship of the state or putting the state's goals over and above our religious identities and our religious convictions. The Christian in Christian nationalism is much more about identity, and particularly an ethno-national identity, than it is about any particular religion or theology. But it uses the language and the symbols of Christianity in ways that can be very confusing to a casual observer. And here's the critical part that I think is really incumbent on Christian communities to wrestle with. Because Christian nationalism and its predecessors of the doctrine of discovery and all of these other ideological makeups that really elevated whiteness and merged it into a sense of religious identity, because those are so long-standing, we have to wrestle with the ways that American Christianity has been polluted by Christian nationalism for centuries. And so in many ways, the Christianity that we are putting into our theologies, into our worship practices, into the songs we sing, into the way even that we interpret Scripture, that it isn't such a neat distinction that Christian nationalism is not present. And so I think that is the really hard work that is incumbent on Christian communities to do, to really wrestle with how has Christian nationalism impacted our understanding of Christianity as a religion, and how can we move more closely to the teachings of Jesus and reject the false teachings of Christian nationalism. And that is work that I think is best done in religious communities and in the kind of thing that we are hoping to do with putting out resources like the curriculum that this church has been using, and a lot of other resources out there now to really grapple with the difference between the two. I also want to talk about Christian nationalism and patriotism. Now, patriotism is a very complicated topic, right? But I really want to kind of boil it down to a pretty simple definition of patriotism as a love of country. And there are many ways that people can show a love of country. They can do it in symbolic ways. That can include waving an American flag, or singing the national anthem, or doing other things that show kind of an evidence, an allegiance to, and a love of country. But patriotism is not forced. Patriotism is not a requirement. It is not a requirement that we worship our country or that we show a love for country. That is not a requirement of citizenship. Nationalism, on the other hand, is an allegiance to country that is first forced and demanded. There's no option about whether you are going to be nationalist or not. And it demands supremacy over all other allegiances, including allegiances, any kind of religious convictions we have, and any kind of allegiance that we have to Jesus. And so I think one question to ask when we're kind of wrestling with this question of, is this patriotism or is this nationalism, is to say, does my patriotism require me to sacrifice my religious convictions? And if the answer is yes, then I would say that is not patriotism. That has gone into the dangerous territory of nationalism and should be rejected. So there isn't a false choice here. You know, you don't have to, you can be patriotic while rejecting Christian nationalism. You don't have to choose between the two, but you also have to understand, I believe, personally, that there's a wide range of ways of showing your patriotism, that there's not just one way to show your patriotism. And so that can include voting, helping other people to vote, using our First Amendment freedoms, including our freedom to protest. Those are all, I believe, patriotic displays. And the kind of narrow, forced, this is the only way to be patriotic, that looks more like nationalism. And so it's really important as we dismantle Christian nationalism that we try to tell the difference between the two of these. I also want to talk about the difference between Christian nationalism and faith-based advocacy, because there is also a false choice given out there, or I think a very false criticism from those who are not liking that we're calling out Christian nationalism. Oh, well, you just want to push Christians out of the public square, or you just don't think that Christians have a right to speak up. And that is not at all the case. I mean, I am an example of a Christian who is speaking up very loudly in the public square. I am just speaking out against Christian nationalism. Robin talked about when I've testified to Congress recently. I am the only person who's ever been asked by Congress to deliver testimony on Christian nationalism, and I've done it twice. But I lead a Baptist organization, so I am a faith leader who is in the public square calling out Christian nationalism. So the very first principle in our Christians Against Christian Nationalism statement is that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. And so the problem is, as we see here on the right, the picture from January 6th, we have lots of examples of people who are claiming Christianity here with their Jesus Save signs and other Christian symbols. We have lots of examples of Christians who are not behaving constructively in the public square, using violent actions here on January 6th to try to overthrow the results of the election. And we need more examples of Christians from all different backgrounds, and people of faith from all different backgrounds, and people who don't hold a faith tradition from all different perspectives, all of these people coming into the public square and advocating from whatever their conscience is. There's a difference between being motivated by your faith to be in the public square and by coming to the public square to insist that your certain religious view is reflected in law and policy. So that's the difference between faith-based advocacy and Christian nationalism. We can come motivated by our faith to push for certain policies, but we do so without insisting that our particular religious view be reflected in law and policy to the exclusion of other people's religious views. That's the importance of, and I believe, constructive engagement in our pluralistic system. We could talk about all kinds of ways that Christian nationalism is impacting public policy. I'm going to center into one example, and maybe some of the other examples will come up in the Q&A later, but I want to talk about how Christian nationalism is showing up in our public schools. I think we have a lot of examples right here in Texas that this is happening, but it's not just Texas, it's all over the country. I'm going to talk some about this multi-prong attack on public education and how this is being shown, how there is a cycle of how Christian nationalism fits into this cycle. So this multi-prong attack goes something like this, that we will underfund our public schools, and in doing so, sow distrust in the public schools. And when public schools don't have enough money, then they can't operate as they should. So they create a problem, and then they say, but look, public schools, you're unwilling to solve the problem, and so we have a solution. Let's have vouchers that take more money away from public schools and put them into private education. And this is a cycle that we're seeing all over the country and here in Texas as well. And so this is one public policy way that we are underfunding public schools where everyone is required to be served regardless of religious belief, and without the public schools pushing any one religion onto to their students, in favor of a system that would send public money to private schools, including to private religious schools. Some ways that Christian nationalism is showing up in some of these public education policy disputes. One is this teaching of a Christian nation mythology in place of a more honest history that shows the background and how the First Amendment, for instance, came into being, but instead teaching a pseudo-history that talks about the United States as a Christian nation. Whenever you see in public policy language around Judeo-Christian values, that is likely a buzzword for Christian nationalism, because it is an effort to look inclusive. Look, this isn't just Christianity, this is Judaism and Christianity together, so we're going to call it Judeo-Christian values. But it is made up. The term Judeo-Christian is made up. There is no such thing as the Judeo-Christian religion. But it is also a made-up term that has been kind of placed in modern day times to try to create a history that wasn't there at the founding, to legitimize this false history teaching. We also see examples of posting "In God We Trust" in public schools as was noted here on this slide. This was a bill that has been pushed by a group called the Congressional Prayer Caucus Foundation in a number of different states, including in Texas. The Texas legislature passed this law a couple of sessions ago. And then last session, the Texas legislature came back and introduced a bill that would require the posting of the 10 Commandments in every public school classroom in the state of Texas. That bill failed, not by lack of votes, but because time ran out in the 2023 legislature. But we can expect that such a bill will be filed again. And just a couple of weeks ago, Louisiana passed that bill. Again, this is model legislation that's being pushed in all states. And so Louisiana, I believe, became the first state to actually pass the bill requiring the posting of the 10 Commandments in public school classrooms. We also see bills that would allow the teaching of the Bible as an elective course in public schools. Again, not requiring it, but putting that, getting that foot in the door of saying, well, but students can be allowed to take a class on Bible, again, taught by public school teachers. We also see it in bills such as in the state of Florida, the Don't Say Gay bills, book bans, which has been a huge problem in local communities around the country, and in this relatively new idea of actually encouraging the hiring of school chaplains in public schools. I want to talk a little bit more in depth about school chaplain. So this is a bill that was actually passed by the Texas legislature last session and took effect on September 1st of last year. And in this, the law now said that school districts and open enrollment charter schools had to vote within 6 months on whether to accept volunteer chaplains. And the only requirement was that they pass a criminal background check. There was no definition in the law about what a chaplain is, just any person who could pass a criminal background check. So I don't know everyone's status here, but I bet many of us here are now we're all chaplains if we can pass a criminal background check. And so that obviously has so many problems for the public schools because there's no requirement for any kind of special licensure, special training, and there's also no protection for the religious freedom rights of their children and their families because there's no requirement in the bill on what the chaplains can or can't do with the children, and so they can, counsel them religiously in any way, they can proselytize to them, and the Texas bill also did not require any kind of parental consent. So the children at any age could be counseled by these school chaplains. Now here's the good news. Most school districts in Texas opted not to adopt this policy. And that is because of advocacy from people on the ground. I mean, first it's because it's just a really bad idea. I called it a problem in search of a problem. It's not like any school district said, this is what we need. The legislature kind of created this problem and then put forth really bad policy in order to further it. And so the question might be, who really wants this? Well, it's a group called the National School Chaplains Association. The parent organization of this group is something called Mission Generation. And the stated purpose of Mission Generation is this, and I am just quoting from their tax filing documents about why they exist. It says, Mission Generation works through public education to win, disciple, and send pre-K to 12th grade youth. The ministry goal is to have 100 million people in discipleship by 2025 by offering the school chaplain program in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. So their stated purpose is to proselytize and convert 100 million children by using school chaplains. And since Texas was the first state in the country to pass their law, and since then more than a dozen other states have introduced similar legislation, Florida so far is the only other state to actually pass the legislation. But this shows, I think, one, really the concerted effort of this group to pass this law to really have the public schools be proselytizing children into the Christian faith, but also, which I believe is an incredible infringement on religious freedom for these children and their families. But also that there is an opportunity for resistance. There is an opportunity for people on the local level to say, no, we don't want this. And so, for example, in Texas, not every school district even took up a vote on this. But of those who did, the 25 largest school districts in Texas all said, no, we don't want this. But they were also much smaller school districts that said no. And so this is not something that is being implemented on a wide scale level at this point, but is something to stay alert to. And it shows, I think, a really concerted effort by those who are ambassadors of Christian nationalism to really target public schools as the next place where they're really going to push Christian nationalism. So we are about to get to the Q&A, but I don't want to leave you just feeling discouraged. I want to talk about what can we do? What do we do to resist Christian nationalism? Those numbers I told you said that the majority of people are not, the vast majority of people are not totally bought into Christian nationalism, and the majority aren't either. And so how does the majority of people who are skeptical or rejecting of Christian nationalism, how do we push back? Well, one way, just one very specific way, is to get involved in the larger advocacy efforts of saying no to school chaplains. Fortunately, here in Texas, we don't have a current need, but we do have a national need. And so since this is now being exported in other places, we are trying to get the word out to people in other states to join advocacy efforts to oppose school chaplain laws. And so if you go to this QR code, you'll go to our webpage that has all kinds of ways that you can be engaged. You can learn more about this issue. You can share it with other people. If you are a chaplain, or you, and not the kind of chaplain that Texas says you are, but someone who is a licensed or otherwise professional chaplain in any context, there's a particular advocacy ask for you to speak up to share your concerns about importing a chaplaincy program into a public school context. And that is work that's being done on a national level. And so if you are a chaplain or if you know of chaplains, I'd really ask you to share this information with them in particular as a way to get involved in the ongoing advocacy efforts. Another way to get involved is to join the growing movement of Christians against Christian nationalism. Our growing network is now 38,000 people. We have people in every congressional district in the state of Texas, and we have a large group here in Texas, and particularly in North Texas. So if you go to this QR code, you can read the statement of principles that makes you a Christian against Christian nationalism. It is not a statement of faith, okay? Because there is no one faith that can unite any group of Christians together, but rather it is a statement of principles. You may ask, but I'm not a Christian. How do I get involved in this? There are other ways for people who don't identify as Christian to get involved, and you can email us if you go to this website, you can see the email address and you can get in touch with us about other ways to do it as well. Regardless of your faith background, there is another way for you to get involved. And this is really exciting. And as Robin mentioned earlier, I do live here. I live in Dallas. I live in this area here. And we are organizing our first coalition project, local coalition for organizing Christians against Christian nationalism right here in North Texas. And we hired our very first organizer. Lisa Jacob is here with me today. And Lisa has been on the ground working since December and is doing a fantastic job of meeting and connecting with people in this area who are concerned and want to work together. not just to dismantle Christian nationalism, but how do we envision and bring about the kind of beloved community that we want to live in? A place full of equity and justice and fairness for everyone, regardless of religious belief. To really live into that ideal and that promise that our belonging doesn't matter is not contingent on our religious beliefs or the way that we worship or how we identify. And what does that mean? What would that mean? And so we are dreaming together, we are planning together, and we are acting together for that more liberative vision for society that we want. And we want you to be a part of it. And so if you go to this QR code, this is a special QR code that is only for people in this area. This is not a national invitation, but you can sign up that you want to be part of this growing movement right here in North Texas. And so with that, that is the end of my formal presentation, and I'd love to take some questions.
Okay, I'm on. We got several questions, and I don't think we'll have time to get to all of them. So if we don't get to your question, then perhaps you can talk with Lisa or Amanda afterwards. So a couple of sort of specific ones. How do you feel about the commercials, Jesus Gets Us? The message is good, but when you research who is behind it, it is supported by far-right conservatives.
I have a lot of feelings about these ads. For one thing, I don't think Jesus needs an ad campaign, and I really feel like that money, that Jesus would want us to be spending that money to help people and not to defend his PR, right? That's kind of like the basic. And I will say, as it relates to Christian nationalism, I think that there have been some studies done that a lot of the funding for that ad campaign comes from some of the individuals and groups that are most pushing Christian nationalism in the public policy space. I think the content of the ads is quite compelling, right? But I think that there are better ways, including us actually taking care of people who don't have the resources because of unjust policies in this country. That would be a much better way for us to show the love of Jesus to our neighbors.
Another sort of specific one. What about prayer at city council meetings?
Great question. Prayer at city council meetings. So, and we can, Robin talked about the podcast that I co-host, Respecting Religion. We had a whole episode on this topic. So just a little bit of background. Several years ago, there was a case from the U.S. Supreme Court called Grease versus Galloway. And in that case, the Supreme Court ruled, and it might have been 5-4, I'm not exactly sure, but the majority ruled that it was constitutional to have prayers at city council meetings. So this is a relatively new thing, because before then, there is prayer before Congress and for state legislative sessions, but that's a very different kind of legislative body than a city council meeting or a school board meeting, where citizens are coming directly in front of their legislators to ask for something. And the signal that it sends and the opportunity for coercion for people who are present to be forced or to feel forced to participate in some kind of religious exercise like prayer is much stronger in those direct democracy situations than when we think about representative democracy in Congress or even in the state legislature. And so I think from, again, this idea that we are all equal and that how our city council rules on or treats us, that to make sure that that isn't dependent on religion, I think that prayer sends an opposite message. And so and having that sectarian prayer doesn't send that message of neutrality that's really important in those government settings. And so at BJC, we talk about how just because it's legal, just because it's constitutional, doesn't mean it's right, doesn't mean that it protects religious freedom for all. So a much better way, I think, to handle that in those situations is to have a moment of silence. That gives space if people want to solemnize the proceedings, if people want to have a quiet moment to center themselves, and then they can use it in any way they want. But it keeps the actual proceeding and the government officials neutral when it comes to religion.
So many have bought into the America was founded as a Christian nation mantra. They say it is in our Constitution, it is in our pledge, and on our money. How do you respond to that?
Well, different ways. So for the Constitution question, that's probably the easiest. The word Christianity is not in the Constitution. Neither is God. The only reference to religion in the original Constitution is in Article 6, which says there shall be no religious tests for public office. And so my favorite rejoinder to that is the framers of the Constitution, very smart people. If they wanted to create a Christian nation, they could have done it. And probably the most ineffective way to create a Christian nation is to say no religious tests for public office. So they were actually rejecting the idea of a Christian nation in the founding document. The money in the pledge, so the money in God We Trust was first put on the money around the Civil War. So under One Nation Under God and the pledge was added in the 1950s. So these are other high points of Christian nationalism in the culture. We saw rising Christian nationalism around the Civil War. We saw it again in the 1950s. There was another period of high Christian nationalism in the 1920s. And so we see, this is kind of when I started saying, undercutting these constitutional principles, there's always been this ideology of Christian nationalism, and it shows up in different ways. But that in itself is not evidence of an intent to create or legislate Christianity, certainly by the framers of the Constitution. And just because it was done before doesn't mean we should perpetuate it now, particularly when we have so much more religious diversity and pluralism in the culture now. And from a religious point of view, I think it really cheapens the idea of God and religion to put it on our money or to say it in a rote way, and to put under God, One Nation Under God in the Pledge of Allegiance is the kind of merging of religious and national identity in a way that could cause us to misplace our allegiance and to worship state over God.
Okay, this last one I'm combining two. The first part, how can we debunk the fear that is driving much of the Christian nationalism movement and rhetoric and being used as a propaganda tool? And related to that is, what are your suggestions on how to start this conversation with family members who are closed-minded and from small towns? Good luck.
Great question. What was the first part again? I'm sorry, I was talking about how to start.
Sorry, the first part was about debunking the fear that's driving much of this rhetoric.
Yeah. Well, I think that the premise of the question really gets at something really important, and that is the sense that fear really is driving a lot of Christian nationalism. And understanding that, I think identifying with that in some way or empathizing with it in some way. And that also gets to the second part of the question, how you talk about it with people. I think you'll notice in the way that I talk about Christian nationalism, and we talk about it at the campaign, that is sometimes a little different than you might hear it in the culture. I don't say Christian nationalist. You know, I say an ambassador of Christian nationalism. I think that doesn't define, the ideology doesn't define a person. And if we talk about it as an ideology that we have an opportunity to either embrace or reject, sometimes on a daily basis, then we can enter into a conversation in a place of more humility with the person who we're in conversation with. The best people that you can have conversation with on about Christian nationalism are people you're already in relationship with. And so I wouldn't say that, it's really helpful to get into a social media debate with someone that you don't have a relationship with. Maybe someone you once had a relationship with, but you haven't talked to in 20 years, but they're still on your social media feed, and you get into a debate with them. That's really not productive conversation. But people that you're already in relationship with, how do you hold them in a sense of love and care, and be curious, ask questions, understand a little bit more about what's driving it, and then offer some of your own reflection of how you've grown in your understanding of Christian nationalism or of white supremacy or of racism, and that is not trying to convince them, but trying to understand someone else and then kind of come to a common understanding with them, I think is really helpful. I will say I talk about some of this. I do have a forthcoming book that's coming out in October called How to End Christian Nationalism. And there's a whole chapter on how do we take on Christian nationalism close to home in our faith communities, in our families, and some ideas about how to do that in a way that really can help someone and again doesn't try to change someone's mind, but to come to a better understanding. And that's the kind of work we're trying to do with our organizing project as well. So that would be another great place to get engaged.